No. I'm one of 3 sergeants that are on that shift, though, but no partner.
Are you assigned a car?
Yes, sir.
When you ride, then you ride solo?
Yes, sir.
Now, you've, as a Minneapolis police officer, you've signed a certification that you're familiar with various Minneapolis Police Department policies. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
And as part of that, in addition to all of the policies that have been introduced, we're just going to focus on that of critical incident response. All right? Now, when we looking back to May 2020, you were supervising the dog watch shift. Were you working on May 25, 2020?
Yes, sir, I was.
Okay. And when do you recall beginning your shift?
Like I said, I'm the dog watch shift. Our shift started at 20-30 hours, which is 8:30 p.m.
And what's the first thing you do when you start the shift?
First thing I do is conduct roll call with my officers.
Describe what the roll call involves.
Roll call is basically attendance, making sure all the officers are there, everybody's there, accounted for, they're ready to work. It's a time where we pass along pertinent information about what has gone on during the day, or maybe what crime patterns and things to be aware of. And if the officers have anything that needs to be brought to the table, they can as well. Roll call concludes with me giving the officers their squad assignments and then sending them on their way so that they can start answering 911 calls.
And do you typically receive information from the previous shifts that you can pass it along to the officers you're sending out in your shift?
Sometimes. Sometimes, yeah.
You're generally familiar with the officers that you personally supervise?
Yes.
And other officers within the 3rd Precinct? Are you familiar with other officers in the 3rd Precinct who are not necessarily on your specific shift?
Oh, yes, yes.
Are you familiar with an individual named Derek Chauvin?
Not personally, but I do know who he is.
Okay. Do you believe you'd recognize him if you saw him?
Absolutely.
Do you see him in the courtroom today?
Yes.
Would you please point to him and... Thank you. Your Honor, may the record reflect that the witness has identified the defendant? How do you know him?
Like I said, I don't know him personally. We worked out of the same building, but we worked on different shifts. I wasn't his direct supervisor.
Sort of a name and face recognition.
Absolutely.
Never socialized outside of work?
No.
Are you familiar with an officer named Tu Tao?
Yes, I know who he is.
Okay. Is it the same nature, basically the same type of relationship as the defendant?
Yes, we worked out of the same building, but we were on different shifts.
And Thomas Lane?
Yes.
How would you describe your relationship with Thomas Lane?
He was also on the mid-watch shift, but Thomas Lane did do a rotation when they were new on my shift, and I believe he was on my shift for about a month when he was, I think it was probably his 2nd month on the job.
Have you ever interacted with him outside of a work setting?
No, sir.
And Alexander King?
Him as well. Okay. Same relation. He and Officer Lane were both on my shift for approximately a month, and I believe that was also his 2nd month of being on the job.
So I'd like
that was while they were on their FTO rotation. They rotate between different shifts.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'd like to then bring you back to that roll call on the date in question. Did you receive a telephone call around roll call time?
I believe the phone call was shortly, just as roll call concluded, yes.
And who was that phone call from?
I received a phone call from Sergeant Kluger, who was the mid-watch sergeant.
Do you recall what Sergeant Kluger, let me back up. Did Sergeant Kluger give you information that you relied upon to take further steps in your duties that night.
Yes.
Okay. What did Sergeant Kluger tell you?
Sergeant Kluger informed me that he was at the hospital at that time, and he was with a male that he described may or may not live. Later on in the night, I found out that that male was Mr. Floyd. He said he was down there at the hospital. He asked me if I would be willing to respond to the incident location of 38th in Chicago because he was tied up at the hospital at the time. He asked me if I would respond down there just to make sure, just in case we had to secure that area, and make contact with any of his officers that were there on scene still, because this had the potential to be a possible critical incident.
Can you describe then what you mean by critical incident?
Usually an officer-involved incident where either the officer or somebody else has died, or an officer or somebody else has suffered great bodily harm that later led to death.
And based on your knowledge of Minneapolis Police Department policy, what is supposed to happen if there is a critical incident with the crime scene and with the participants?
A crime scene is supposed to be secured, which means locked down, and that is for the purpose to preserve any evidence that is there. The involved parties or the involved officers usually are chilling and awaiting escort sergeants so that they can be escorted to an interview room downtown. Appropriate notifications are made. IA, homicide, if you will, the upper administration. The area is canvassed, which just means there's a designated amount of officers that are searching the area looking for any witnesses that can give a synopsis of what they saw. And then we wait for the investigators to get there, car 21, and pretty much wait for further information from some of the superiors.
Do you take any steps with respect to body-worn cameras and ensuring that those are activated?
Absolutely.
What do you do?
And ensure that everybody's body-worn cameras are active and running at all times.
And in this specific case, did you take steps consistent with the procedures you just outlined?
Yes, when I arrived on scene, yes.
At this time, I'd like to publish Exhibit 1. After you got off the phone with Sergeant Kluger, did you go directly to 38th in Chicago?
I told Sergeant Kluger that I didn't mind going down there. I just had to gather some of my things and then I'd head down there. So I believe I got down there to 38th in Chicago at about 9:35 p.m. is when I arrived there.
Were you wearing your body-worn camera?
Yes.
And it was activated?
Yes.
Can you please describe the scene as you recall it when you arrived?
38th in Chicago, so it's kind of a high-profile area. 38th Street and Chicago Avenue are both major thoroughfares in South Minneapolis. When I arrived, the only people that were there were Officers King and Lane, it seemed. There wasn't very many other people around when I arrived there.
Now, you indicated that your body-worn camera was activated, and prior to testifying today, you've had an opportunity to review various still photographs taken from the footage of your body-worn camera. Is that right?
Yes.
And at this time, Your Honor, I'm going to offer Exhibits 81 through 95, which are images taken from Sergeant Edwards' body-worn camera.
Any objection?
No, Your Honor.
81 through 95 inclusive are received.
You indicated that Officers King and Lane were at the scene when you arrived.
I did.
Publish Exhibit 81. Do you recognize the individuals in this photograph, Exhibit 81?
I do.
And who is this individual?
It's Officer Lane.
And this?
It's Officer King.
Can you tell the jury what, if any, interaction you had with Officers Lane and King when you arrived?
When I arrived there, I was met by Officer King first. First thing I did was I told him, hey, if your body-worn camera is not on, turn it on now. He did. Officer Lane came out of the car several seconds afterwards, told the same thing to him, and he activated his body-worn camera.
All right, so Lane was initially sitting in the car.
Yes, sir.
Do you know what car?
His squad car, the one that's pictured right there.
Is that 320?
Sure.
Is that a squad car assigned to that sector within the 3rd Precinct?
Yeah, that's a middle watch squad.
After you instructed both officers to activate or make sure their body-worn camera was activated, did you tell them anything else they needed to do?
Yes, I asked them where they had interaction with Mr. Floyd. They told me that they interacted with him on the sidewalk there by their squad car. They also told me they interacted with him on Chicago Avenue, right in front of the Cup Foods store.
And based on those statements, then, did you direct them to place crime scene tape around the area to preserve the scene?
Yes. So with that information, I was able to gather where the incident occurred, and then I instructed them to place crime scene tape around the area so that we could preserve any potential evidence that was there.
First, I'm going to ask to publish Exhibit 82. All right, what do you see in this photograph?
That appears to be Officer King putting up crime scene tape.
And publish Exhibit 1. Do you have one of these up there, a little stylus?
Yeah.
If you could use that to just roughly outline the area that will show where the crime scene tape was put up generally.
Okay, so generally, their squad was right here at the time. This is different. Their squad was here. Mr. Floyd's vehicle was right here. I had them encompass this whole area. So crime scene tape was around that whole intersection. It encompassed the entire intersection.
At the time you were having them do this, were there any other officers in the area at the time, or was it just King and Lane?
At that time, I believe it was myself, King, and Lane, but I had other officers from my shift responding to the area because I knew we were going to probably have to lock down that area.
So you asked the other officers to
Yes.
arrive? That wasn't something that was arranged before?
No.
And the purpose
I
of-
asked for additional officers.
Let's try not to talk over each other.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No problem. No problem.
All right. And that was for the specific purpose of keeping the area secure?
Yes, sir.
Okay. If you would clear that, Your Honor. And at some point, did you learn that this, in fact, was a critical incident?
Later on in the night, yes.
But you were taking steps to secure the scene as if it were going to be a critical incident before that?
Yes, sir.
So at this point, did you really know anything about what had happened that caused you to be called out there specifically?
No, I didn't know specifics. No, at that point, I had very little specifics.
For
I
example,
was waiting for more phone calls from Sergeant Kluger for more direction of what was going on.
For example, you didn't know the defendant was involved at that point. Is that right?
Correct.
You had a brief interaction and conversation with King and Lane. Is that right?
Yes.
Based then on what they told you, you took some additional steps. Were you able to then communicate with the other officers that you directed to come to the scene to provide them direction?
Yes.
What did you ask the other officers to do?
A number of the officers I asked to canvass the area. As I explained before, that just means pretty much go door to door, see if there's any potential witnesses that may have been there when the incident occurred, and obtain a synopsis of what they saw, and to get their name and information. It's just searching for any potential witnesses and getting their story.
If we could publish Exhibit 83, another image from your body-worn camera, you see some of the other officers from your shift who you called to help you with the scene.
Yes, sir.
I'm going to ask you to just identify some of the folks in the picture. We'll start, of course, here. Who's that?
It's Officer Lane,
Right. And this individual?
Officer Nerling,
Okay. And this person?
it's Officer Cape,
This person?
Officer Oaks,
And this person?
and Officer Areola.
And Officer Areola was a fairly new officer at the time?
Yes, sir.
Now, would you please tell the jury just sort of the scope of the security you provided to this scene at that time during these it was the early morning hours now of May 26th, is that right?
Yes, sir.
What did you do?
I shortly thereafter here, I received a call from Kluger telling me that escort officers or escort sergeants would be coming down, and that he was still downtown or at the hospital. I had been notified, and appropriate people in administration had been notified, and he just requested that the scene just remained secure. So, in answer to your question, we, my guys and I just remained there for scene security to ensure that no vehicle or pedestrian traffic entered the crime scene and contaminated our scene.
You made sure no one came in to that roped off area.
Yes.
Did you take any steps with respect to the business cup foods?
Yes.
What did you do?
Sergeant Kluger asked me if I was able to make contact with the manager, and if so, speak with him, which I did.
How many officers at any given time were used to secure this scene?
I believe that night I only had about maybe 8 to 10 officers on. And I didn't have every single one of my officers on this scene. So there were still a lot of 911 calls that needed to be attended to.
In addition to securing the perimeter of the scene, did you secure any vehicles within the scene?
Yes, sir.
And what vehicles did you secure?
Officers King and Lane squad, as well as Mr. Floyd's vehicle that was parked ahead of theirs.
And could you describe that vehicle, please?
I honestly don't remember what kind of vehicle Mr. Floyd was driving.
Okay.
It was a dark colored vehicle, though, if I remember correctly.
Did you keep officers King and Lane out of the squad 320?
Yes, I did. And I told them to leave their belongings inside the squad car.
At this time, I'd like to publish Exhibit 84. So Exhibit 84, then, for the record, is a photo from your body-worn camera taken at 21:50 and 17 seconds. Is that right?
Yes.
And we see both King and Lane in the photo, correct?
Yes.
All right. And is this where you had the initial interaction with them, where you asked them to get out of the vehicle so you could secure it?
That is.
And they complied with it?
They did.
Did you see anyone, including them, take anything out of the vehicle?
No.
Was the vehicle running or had it been stopped?
It was running.
What did you do since it was running?
I told them to get out of the car. They got out of the car.
And did you, at any point, stop the vehicle from running?
That wasn't until the BCA showed up, and I believe it was Special Agent Mike Phil told me that they were going to take custody of the squad and Mr. Floyd's vehicle. We noticed the vehicle, or we noticed the squad car, I'm sorry, was still running, so he instructed me to power it down.
You'd also mentioned something about a canvass. Did you at some point instruct officers to do a canvass of the area for possible witnesses?
Yes, I explained that, yes.
Mm-hmm. And what, since you didn't know much about what had happened, what were you asking the officers to look for?
Anybody that may have been in the area at the time that the incident occurred. We knew that the incident occurred before we got to work, so I guess we were just trying to get lucky. Maybe there was somebody still there that was willing to talk to us, or yeah.
Who did you send out to do the canvass? Was it
several officers.
Did that include Areola and Nerling?
Yes, it did.
They locate any witnesses who are willing to speak with you?
What was that?
Did they locate any witnesses who are willing to speak with you?
Who were willing to speak with me?
Yes.
No.
Did you at any point interact with an elderly or an older gentleman, I won't say elderly, older gentleman at the scene?
Yes.
Did he identify himself to you, first or last name?
He identified himself to me as Charles. He refused to give me his name, his full name.
Published Exhibit 87. This is another body-worn camera image, not from your body-worn camera, but it shows, who is this?
That's me.
Okay. And is this Charles?
Yes, sir.
And this point captures the conversation that you had with him at 22:05 and about 43 seconds. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
He did not provide any information to you.
No, he did not. I explained to him that he'd be very valuable to us if he had something to say or if he saw something, but he told me he refused to say anything and wondered if he was under arrest, and I told him no, and he told me he wanted to leave.
And of course, you didn't know whether or not he had spoken with anybody already about this incident.
Correct. That was the first time I'd seen him.
Did you ask King and Lane to participate in the canvass?
No, I don't believe I did. No.
What did you ask them to do?
I asked them to chill out because later on I knew from Sergeant Pluger that he had a couple of escort sergeants coming down to transport them to interview room 100.
Publish Exhibit 85. All right, looking at Exhibit 85 from your body-worn camera at 21:51:25, you see officers Lane and King. Were they standing where you told them to stand, waiting where you told them to wait?
Correct.
And at this time, you instructed them to keep their body-worn cameras activated. Is that right?
Correct.
Do you recall speaking with any other potential witnesses while you were at the scene?
No, I don't.
Do you recall entering Cup Foods?
Yes. Yes.
speak with anybody at Cup Foods?
Yes. Like I said before, Sergeant Pluger asked me to see if I could make contact with the manager there at Cup Foods, and I did, and I spoke with him.
Publish Exhibit 86. All right, this is an image from your body-worn camera at 21:54 and 32 seconds. Who is that individual?
I do not remember his name, but he is the manager there at Cup Foods.
And did you learn whether or not he was a witness to the interaction between the police and George Floyd?
He said he didn't witness anything. I had a brief conversation with him.
Now, when you arrived, you testified that you had taken control of the scene, right? As the sergeant, you were the ranking officer there.
Yes, sir.
At some point, did another ranking officer arrive at the scene?
Yes. Lieutenant Zimmerman from Homicide arrived at the scene shortly after, as well as Sergeant Dale.
Publish Exhibit 88. All right. I know that that's a little hard to see, but can you identify the people in this photo?
That's myself, and that's Lieutenant Zimmerman.
When did he arrive approximately? If you could take the cutout out.
When did he arrive approximately?
Yes.
I couldn't tell you the time he arrived. I can tell you the timestamp that I'm seeing right there.
Yeah.
22:06.
All right.
So that would be 10:06 p.m.
So even if not exact arrival time, this is pretty close in time to Lieutenant Zimmerman's first arrival?
Yes.
All right. When Lieutenant Zimmerman arrived, what happened with the scene?
He came and just ensured that we had the scene secure. He came and ensured that we had officers that were canvassing the area for any potential witnesses that were still there. Yeah.
Did you see Lieutenant Zimmerman interact with either the involved officers, Lane or King?
I don't recall seeing him interact with Lane or King.
Did you
Might have.
impart to Lieutenant Zimmerman any information that you had gathered about the scene or potential witnesses to that point?
Can you ask that question again?
Sure. Did you tell Lieutenant Zimmerman what you did up to that point to get him kind of caught up on the scene and the witnesses and what steps had been taken?
Oh, yes.
All right. Did he direct you to take any further steps now he's a lieutenant, so I suppose.
More canvassing of the area, and also he wanted more officers there at the scene.
Did he confirm that the scene itself was secured
Yes.
and that the squad was secured, 320,
Yes.
and that Mr. Floyd's vehicle was secured?
Yes.
So there was another officer there, a Sergeant Bob Dale. What is Bob Dale assigned to?
He was there. He came with Lieutenant Zimmerman.
Bob Dale's from Homicide, is that right?
I believe so.
And then with this being a critical incident, this was going to be handed over to the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, correct?
Well, at that point, we still didn't know if this was indeed a critical incident, but I was going under the assumption that it was, it's better safe to go that way than not.
And because of that, there were some steps taken to ensure that when this was handed off, it would be handed off in a manner that it could be taken over with smoothly, correct?
Yes.
So it was, did either Dale or Zimmerman make a suggestion to you about having a crime scene log?
Yes.
All right. What did they ask for?
They just asked if a crime scene log had been started, and I tasked Officer Areola with that task. Crime scene log is just a log of names of officers and personnel that entered the crime scene.
And did you see Officer Areola start compiling a crime scene log?
Yes.
The published Exhibit 89. Right, you can see this Officer Areola here,
Yes.
and he appears to be holding something. Is that right?
Yes.
Is that the crime scene log?
I believe so.
So as you testified, at some point you learned that Mr. Floyd had died, correct?
Yes.
And do you recall how you received that information?
It was later on in the night, Sergeant Dale actually informed me that Mr. Floyd had passed away.
Was that pretty shortly after Dale and Zimmerman had arrived?
Yeah. Yes.
About 10:13 p.m., is that right?
It was sometime after Sergeant Dale and Lieutenant Zimmerman arrived.
And after that point, were there arrangements made for transport officers to bring Lane and King to City Hall pursuant to critical incident protocol?
There were.
Did you watch that happen?
Yes. Officers Walitsky and Officer Ashoff responded to the scene, and they were Officer King and Officer Lane's transport sergeants.
Published Exhibit 90. There's additional body-worn camera footage. Do you see Officer or Sergeant Ashoff in this photo?
Yes.
Would you take your stylus and draw a circle? And Waletsky?
I don't see Walitsky in this photo.
Was this so according to the timestamp, 22/18/14? Is that right?
Correct.
Okay. And that was around the time that the transport officers arrived, and I'm assuming the transport would have happened fairly shortly after that.
Correct.
And they transported Lane and King to, what's it, room 100 within City Hall?
Room 100.
And it was about shortly after that, about 15 minutes or so later, that the BCA took over the scene.
Yes, I was notified by Lieutenant Zimmerman that the BCA is on their way and they'll be taking over the scene. So we were requested, me and my guys were requested to just stay put for scene security.
Do you recall when the BCA arrived?
I don't remember what time they arrived, no.
Show you Exhibit 91. Do you remember the name of the agent who was involved?
Yes, I believe his name was a Special Agent Michael Phil.
Can you tell the jury what you see here in Exhibit 91? Who are those people?
That appears to be Special Agent Michael Phil standing alongside Lieutenant Zimmerman.
Right here?
Yes.
And that's at 2300. Is that right?
Correct.
That's the approximate time then that the BCA took over the scene?
Approximately.
You saw Special Agent Phil have a conversation with Lieutenant Zimmerman. After that conversation took place, did you have a conversation with Lieutenant Zimmerman?
I believe I had a conversation with both of them afterwards.
Okay.
Brief interaction.
When did Lieutenant Zimmerman remain at the scene after the BCA took over, or did he leave?
Well, he came up to me and just told me pretty much that it's in the BCA's hands now, and they'll be here, and just to ensure that myself and my officers remained on scene for scene security until the BCA tells us they're done with their job and that we can take down the crime scene tape and leave.
Publish Exhibit 92. And is this Special Agent Phil?
Yes, that is.
During the period of time you were speaking with him and getting instruction on what to do with the scene?
Yes.
Did he ask you to do anything with Squad 320?
Yes.
What did
he
he ask
told
you?
me that they were taking custody of both the squad and Mr. Floyd's vehicle. And we noticed that the squad was still running. He asked me to open it up and power it down, which I did.
Did you remove anything from the vehicle?
No, sir.
Now, at this point, the BCA has the scene, and you're no longer taking any investigative steps or collecting evidence. Is that right?
Correct.
But did you make observations of other officers doing those things, watching the BCA,
Such as?
such as anything with the vehicle?
No. No.
Did
I
you
didn't see anybody doing anything with the vehicles. Any other officer, if that's what you're asking.
Did you see other officers taking photographs, looking at the vehicle?
No, sir.
Did you see any forensic scientists or people you recognize to be forensic scientists come onto the scene?
Just the team of people that Special Agent Michael Phil had with him.
And those
There
were
were
the
several BCA people there.
those were the folks who were allowed in the scene. Is that right?
Yes.
At some point, did you watch Mr. Floyd's vehicle be actually towed away by the BCA?
Yes. Ultimately, Special Agent here had both the squad car as well as Mr. Floyd's vehicle towed from the scene.
And you watched them do that?
Yes, I was still on scene then.
Publish Exhibit 94. Right, is this an image of the BCA towing away Squad 320?
Yes.
And they'd already towed the SUV at this point, is that right?
I believe so.
Can you tell the jury then what you did with the scene after the vehicles were towed away?
After the BCA had the vehicles towed away, it wasn't very long after that Special Agent Michael Phil told me that they were all finished now and we could take down the crime scene tape and leave.
Did you do so?
Yes, sir.
Publish Exhibit 95. This is at 3:34 and 54 seconds. What is this? What does this image show?
That's at 3:34 a.m. and that's me. Those are my hands helping take down the crime scene tape.
And so at this point, then the crime scene was clear, no longer needed to be secured, and you would be able to exit the area. Is that right?
Correct.
All right. Thank you very much. I have no further questions, Your Honor.
You may.
I have no questions for this witness.
Thank you. Thank you, Sergeant. You may step down.
Thank you.
All right. And next witness.
Your Honor, State will call Lieutenant Zimmerman to the stand.
You swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony about to give will be the truth and nothing but the truth?
I do. Thank you.
Lieutenant, if you could give us your full name, spelling each of your names to start off with.
I'm sorry.
Your full name, spelling each of your names.
Okay.
And also, if you could remove your mask.
Okay, thank you. It's Richard Zimmerman, R-I-C-H-A-R-D, and then Zimmerman, Z-I-M-M-E-R-M-A-N.
Mr. Friend.
Thank you. Can you please tell the jurors what you do for a living?
I'm a police officer with Minneapolis Police Department.
How long have you been a police officer?
Since June 3rd of 1981.
And all that with Minneapolis?
No, the first 4 years from 81 to 85, I worked for the Fillmore County Sheriff's Department in southeast Minnesota.
What did you do there?
I was a patrol deputy responding to 911 calls.
And so then it was, 1985 that you started with Minneapolis?
Yes, I had the weekend off and started in Minneapolis in June 5th of 1985.
And are you a licensed peace officer in the state of Minnesota?
Yes, I am.
When did you first obtain your license?
I'm sorry?
When did you first obtain your license?
June 3rd of 1981.
And as a police officer, having that license, are you required to do certain things to maintain that license?
Yes.
What kinds of things do you have to do?
We have to do continuing ed, like any other professional license. And we have to do 40 hours of different education, professional education, in a certain time period. I'm not sure if it's 1 or 2 years.
And if you don't, somebody's going to let you know, right?
Yes, they will.
And so since 1981, have you done all that's been required to maintain your license?
Yes, I have.
When you started with the Minneapolis Police Department in 1985, what was your job? What were your duties?
I was a patrolman. I worked the North Side Precinct. It's called Precinct 4. And I worked the 3rd Precinct. It's called Precinct 3, of course. And then my permanent assignment was the 5th Precinct, which is like Franklin, Nicollet, Hennepin Avenue, Lake Street.
So when you're working as a patrol officer, what kind of things do you do?
Yeah, well, we respond to 911 calls. We, deter crime, or try to deter crime, I should say. Yeah, that's kind of what we do. Traffic control, that kind of thing.
You're out on the streets every day,
Yes.
or at least every day you work, right?
Yes.
And so then, did your job duties change eventually?
Yes, in 1990, crack became really prevalent in the late 80s, and so I joined the crack team in the 5th Precinct, where there were 4 officers and a sergeant, and we would do search warrants, looking for drugs, that kind of thing.
And so what year was that? I'm sorry.
Pardon me?
What year was that?
1990 to 1993.
And what did you do then in 1993?
I took the sergeant's exam and passed it, and was assigned to the adult sex crimes unit.
And so what does it mean to be promoted to sergeant?
Well, you take a series of tests, and once you're promoted, you express your interest as patrol or investigations. And so I talked to the lieutenant in charge of the sex crimes unit and expressed my interest.
So you mentioned having to take an exam?
Yes.
Just like sitting down and, like we do in school, taking an exam.
Yeah, it was a written exam, and once you pass that phase, then you would take an oral exam, and then you were given your scores.
And so you became a sergeant. Did some supervisory responsibilities come with that?
Yes.
Can you just describe for the jurors like what kinds of responsibilities a sergeant takes on?
Yeah, well, as a investigative sergeant, you're assigned a case to follow up with the victims, and you do search warrants. And when you're doing search warrants, you have officers that assist you. So you'll assign them duties that, such as, assisting with the search warrant.
And also have responsibilities to make sure the officers underneath you are properly trained?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And, when I would do search warrants, I would explain to the officers that we don't want anyone to get hurt, either the officers or the subjects.
And so, just continuing with your history, then you went into the sex crimes unit as a sergeant, and subsequent to that, did your responsibilities change?
Yes.
Can you tell the jurors about that?
Yeah, in 1995, the homicide unit was expanding because of the amount of murders that were occurring in Minneapolis in 1995. So they brought in myself and one other guy from the robbery unit, and we were assigned partners in the homicide unit.
And which unit do you currently work in?
1995.
No, which unit do you currently work in?
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. The homicide unit.
So from 1995 to today, you've been in the homicide unit?
Yes.
And did you, sometime during that period, receive another promotion?
Yes.
Tell the jurors about that, please.
Yeah, in 2007, I took a lieutenant's exam, or 2006. I took the lieutenant's exam, and that's a series of, again, written tests and oral. If you pass that phase, then you go on to the oral interview phase, and you're notified of your results. And
so you were promoted to lieutenant?
Yes, I was.
So how did that change your responsibilities and your job duties?
Well, usually when you're promoted, you're assigned to a different unit than you worked. But they asked me to stay in the homicide unit because of my experience. And so I took over the job in 2008, November of 2008. And the duties are, I get called for every death, suspicious death, deaths where, it's clearly a homicide, deaths where officers have any question about how a person may have died. I go out to the scenes.
And do you also supervise other officers?
Yes, I do.
Just describe for the jury, your responsibilities in supervising other officers.
Yes, we have, right now we have 12 detectives in homicide that make up 6 teams. They work with a partner in homicide, and they're on a rotation basis for being on call. They're on call Monday through Monday, and when a team is on call, I'll go out to a scene, assess, what the death may be involved, and I'll call the on-call team to come in and start working the case.
So you still respond to scenes?
Yes.
But you also supervise the work of the investigators?
Yes. I every morning when I come in, I'll pull up, it's called pulling up the cases, and we pull up every death report in Minneapolis, and I'll look through each report, and I'll assign a case that I might have some questions about, and I'll talk to the detectives, explain why I think this needs to be looked into, and that's Monday through Friday kind of thing.
And so are you their direct supervisor then?
Yes.
So you started with Minneapolis Police Department in 1985.
Yes.
Do you know where you are in terms of seniority in the Minneapolis Police Department?
Yes.
Where is that?
I'm the number one officer in seniority. I hate to say that, but I am.
Understood. Were you called out to a scene on May 25th of 2020?
Yes.
And do you recall, why you were called to that scene?
Yeah, homicide responds, or I respond initially to critical incidents. And a critical incident can be anything from a death to a serious injury of either officers or the public. And so I was called in on this one.
So were you technically on duty at that time?
I was at home, and I was notified by my commander of this incident that happened at 38th in Chicago.
And so then did you respond to that scene?
Yes.
And do you recall about what time it was that you arrived at the scene?
It was a little bit after 9 p.m.
And the location of 38th in Chicago, were you familiar with that location at that time?
Yes.
Fair to say no stranger to calls of violent incidents at that intersection?
Yes, absolutely.
And when you arrived, can you just describe for the jury what you first saw when you arrived at that location?
I arrived on 38th Street, and I parked on the southwest corner on 38th Street. I saw yellow tape up, we call it, it's crime scene tape, around the intersection. I saw Sergeant Edwards, who I know from work, on his cell phone. And I saw two officers, and he was like in the middle of the scene, kind of. And then I saw two officers standing on the southwest or the southeast corner of the intersection.
And did you then approach those two officers?
Yes, Sergeant Edwards appeared to be busy on the phone, so I just walked up to the two officers.
And I'm going to show you, we had an opportunity before court to show you a piece of body cam footage, shows you approaching the scene, correct?
Yes.
And that appeared to be a true and accurate representation of your approach to those two officers.
Yes, it is.
And that reflects the time as well.
Yes.
Your Honor, I would offer Exhibit 96.
Any objection?
No objection.
96 is received.
Then we'll publish 96. I'm going to pause here just for a moment if I could. This is the intersection of 38th and Chicago,
Yes.
and it looks like the time reflected here is 21:56.
Yes.
So for those of us who have difficulty with that kind of math even, what is the real time that we would call?
Yeah. It's 4 minutes to 10.
Okay. So it was a little closer to 10 when you arrived?
Yes.
All right. And there is an individual, I know it's dark and it's kind of hard to see, but do you know who the individual is in the crosswalk there?
I don't know.
Okay. And all right, let's continue.
There's the rain.
Where you call from?
I want to stop right here if you could, please. And just for the record, at 21:56:53, you see across the intersection there appears to be a person walking towards us.
Yes.
And do you know who that is?
That would be me.
All right. And we'll continue, please.
I'll give these call back for you. Okay, yep.
How you doing, Lieutenant?
What's going on?
All right, you can take that down. So it appears that you came to the scene in street clothes, right?
Yes.
All right. And that's the moment where you walked up and talked to the two officers?
Yes, I did.
Did you recognize those two officers?
Yeah. No, I didn't.
And you appeared to be on the phone. Do you recall who you were talking to?
I don't know if it was my commander or a deputy chief. I'm not sure.
So then when you arrived there, those two officers looked like you had just asked them a question. Did they give you some information about the incident?
Yes.
And based on that information, what did you conclude about their role in the incident?
There's a thing that we call involved officers and non-involved officers. And based on what they had told me, I determined they were involved officers.
And why would it be important to distinguish between involved and non-involved officers?
Well, if you're an involved officer, you need to be brought down to room 100 at City Hall, and you need to be brought down by a supervisor in separate cars.
And that's just according to policy?
Yes.
And so after having that conversation with them, what did you do next?
I talked to the sergeant, I believe, Sergeant Edwards, and told him that we needed some more people out here. He told me another sergeant was on his way, and I told him that we needed to get these two guys downtown.
And which sergeant, you remember, I'm sorry, which sergeant that was?
I'm sorry?
Which sergeant that was you talked to?
I don't remember.
Okay. Was it Sergeant Edwards?
I believe that's who I first talked to.
Okay. And so showing you Exhibit 90, if we could please. And this is a photograph for the record of 2218. This is you speaking on the phone at that time, correct?
Yes.
All right. And so here you're still dealing with things at the scene, is that right?
Yes.
All right. And so we can take that down, I guess, thanks. The sergeant that you talked to, what kinds of things did you ask that sergeant to take care of?
I asked the patrol sergeant to arrange to have the two involved officers brought down to room 100, and that we needed some more officers at the scene.
And why did you think you needed more officers at the scene?
To search for any possible witnesses or video.
And so then, after having that conversation, what did you do next?
I had called in two of the sergeants from homicide, the on-call team, to assist me.
And as you were doing that, did you undertake any other actions to try and identify things that might be helpful for the investigation?
Yes.
Like what?
If you stand in the center of the intersection and you'd look for, first of all, you look for video cameras that may be hanging from different buildings, or in this case, milestone cameras.
What is a milestone camera?
It's a city camera that's set up in different areas of the city, and they can be monitored to help us deter crime or to help if a crime occurs.
And being familiar with that location, did you believe there was a milestone camera at that intersection?
I knew there was, yes.
Okay. I'm going to show you Exhibit 1. You recognize what's in that photograph?
Yes.
And what is that?
That's the intersection of 38th and Chicago.
Do you know, can you show the jurors, if you want, you can write on the screen, there should be a little stylus there in front of you, where that camera is located?
I believe it was right here.
Okay. And how is it mounted, or where is it mounted?
You know, I'm not sure if it's on a light pole or under a light pole, but it's mounted up high.
Some kind of pole there.
Right.
Okay. In fact, sometimes we call them pole cameras for
Yeah.
the obvious reason.
Yes. The older guys do that.
Older guys and me, is what you mean. When you were at the scene, did you learn more about the condition of Mr. Floyd, the subject?
I did.
Do you recall when, in your time there, you learned about that?
It was after Sergeant Dale arrived.
And so, Sergeant Dale, one of the sergeants you called in to assist?
Yes, Sergeant Bob Dale is one of the homicide teams that I called in.
And so this was after you had arranged the transport officers.
Yes.
And what did you learn about his condition?
That Mr. Floyd had died.
And were some decisions made about what would become of this investigation based on information? Yes. And what was decided?
That the BCA would be in charge of the investigation, the State Bureau of Criminal Apprehension.
And when that decision is made, what's the role of Minneapolis police at that scene?
Well, first it's to support the BCA investigative team with whatever they might need that night. And also it's to secure any witnesses that we may find, to see if they would be willing to talk to the BCA. Also, it's when you're at a scene, trying to locate any video cameras again, and filling in the BCA agents that arrive.
And in fact, at some point, did BCA agents arrive?
Yes.
And when they arrive, just describe a little bit for the jury what the process is and upon their arrival.
Yeah, the BCA agent generally or specifically in this case?
Just generally.
Yeah. When the BCA arrives, they'll come up to you for a briefing, and you tell them what you have at the scene, or what you've learned, and where people are at. You know, like in this case, the officers were brought to room 100, that kind of thing. And then you tell them, or you ask them what help they might need.
And then specifically, did something like that happen here in this case?
Yes.
All right. And I'm going to show you Exhibit 91 on the screen, please. And do you recognize what's depicted in this photograph?
Yes.
And again, this is the intersection of 38th and Chicago?
Yeah, that would be me in the center of the shot, talking with a BCA agent.
And this is starting that process of turning the scene over to them?
Right, yeah.
So the time here shows 2300, about 11 p.m.?
Yes.
And so then did you in fact turn this scene over to the BCA?
Yes, I did.
And that's shortly thereafter concluded your involvement with the scene?
Yes.
You talked earlier about the training you need to do to maintain your peace officer's license, correct?
Yes.
And as a Minneapolis police officer, where do you get that training from?
Well, we'll get it from our training unit. We'll also get it from outside sources, different schools that are being put on. some that are specific to homicide, some that are, a one-day course, some may be a 2-week course, that kind of thing.
Does that training include instruction on the use of force?
Yes.
And how often do you get instruction on the use of force?
Once a year.
And how many officers have to go through that use of force training every year?
Every officer on the police department.
That includes the guy who's number 1 in seniority?
It includes me, yes, absolutely.
And when you, well, let me ask it this way. Are there also Minneapolis Police Department policies about the use of force?
Yes, there is.
And are you required to be familiar with those policies?
Yes, you are.
And when you do that use of force training, does it cover the policies as well?
Yes.
Do you also do some physical activity, taking people down and rolling around?
Yes, we have a mat that we use at our SOC center, and it's like a huge wrestling mat.
And are you familiar with the use of force continuum?
Yes.
Is that part of the Minneapolis Police Department use of force policy?
Yes, it is.
Can you just describe in general what that means to the jurors?
Yeah, so basically the use of force continuum is guidelines, or it's policy actually, that we have to follow. And it's when, for instance, when you arrive at a scene, no matter what the scene, the first level, the lowest level, would be just your presence at a scene in uniform. The next step up may be your verbal skills that you've learned to help diffuse a situation or learn information about whatever the situation is. The next step would be like a soft technique, escorting the person by their arm, that type of thing. The next level would be a hard technique. That's where you would use your, you maybe have to use your mace or handcuffs, that kind of thing. And finally, the top level on the continuum is deadly force.
And so those levels change, how, under what, or for what reasons might that change?
Yeah, well, if you're, say you arrive at a scene and somebody's pointing a gun at you or shooting at you, of course you go to the top level, and that's how they may change.
So it's relative to the threat.
Right, yes.
And are there different kinds of force that officers can use?
Yes.
And have you ever, in all the years you've been working for the Minneapolis Police Department, been trained to kneel on the neck of someone who is handcuffed behind their back in a prone position?
No, I haven't.
Is that, if that were done, would that be considered force?
Absolutely.
What level of force might that be?
That would be the top tier, the deadly force.
Why?
Because of the fact that if your knee is on a person's neck, that can kill him.
And in your training with the Minneapolis Police Department over the years, have you received training on restraining people?
Yes.
Including the use of handcuffs?
Yes.
And when you are handcuffing somebody, when you handcuff them, what is your responsibility as an officer with regard to that person?
Well, could I give you an example?
Okay. Let me ask you this again. If you, as an officer, according to the training, you handcuff somebody behind the back, what's your responsibility with regard to that person from that moment on?
That person is yours. He's your responsibility. His safety is your responsibility. His well-being and is your responsibility.
Once you handcuff somebody, does that affect the amount of force that you should consider using?
Absolutely.
How so?
Once a person is cuffed, the threat level goes down all the way, to they're cuffed. How can they really hurt you,
Well, certainly there could be circumstances when a cuffed person could still be combative.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. But you getting injured is way down.
What do you mean by that?
Well, if you're, you could have some guy try to kick you or something, but you can move out of the way. That person is handcuffed, and they, the threat level is just not there.
So by handcuffing somebody, you've taken away some of their ability to harm you.
Absolutely.
And if somebody who is handcuffed becomes less combative, does that change the amount of force that an officer is to use under policy?
Yes.
How so?
Well, if they become less combative, you may just have them sit down on a curb, or the idea is to calm the person down, and if they are not a threat to you at that point, you try to help them so that they're not as upset as they may have been in the beginning.
In your 30 years of training with the Minneapolis Police Department, in your experience, have you been trained on the prone position?
Yes.
And what has your training been specific to the prone position?
Well, once you secure or handcuff a person, you need to get them out of the prone position as soon as possible because it restricts their breathing.
When you handcuff somebody behind their back, well, as part of training, have you been handcuffed behind the back?
Yes.
And have you been trained on what happens to individuals when they're handcuffed behind the back?
Yes.
So when somebody is handcuffed behind their back, how does it affect them physically?
It stretches the muscles back through your chest, and it makes it more difficult to breathe.
If you put somebody in the prone position, well, is it well known, this danger of putting somebody in the prone position?
Sustained.
How long have you had training on the dangers of the prone position as part of a Minneapolis police officer?
Since 1985.
And is it part of your training regularly to learn about keeping somebody in the prone position?
Yes.
And what has the training been with regard to the prone position?
Once a person is cuffed, you need to turn them on their side or have them sit up. You need to get them off their chest.
Why?
Because of the, as I mentioned earlier, your muscles are pulling back when you're handcuffed. And if you're laying on your chest, that's constricting your breathing even more.
In your training as a Minneapolis police officer, are you provided with training on medical intervention?
Yes.
I assume you're not, taught to be paramedics, but you receive some level of training.
Yeah, we're first responders, I think, is what our category would be.
Does that include doing what we think of as CPR, chest compressions?
Yes.
And how often is that part of your training?
CPR, it's like every other year or so.
And as part of your training within the Minneapolis Police Department policies, is there an obligation to provide medical intervention when necessary?
Absolutely.
What is the general teaching that you get with regard to medical intervention?
Well, again, it's been that you need to provide medical care for the person that is in distress.
And would that be true even if you've called an ambulance to come to the scene?
Yeah, absolutely. The ambulance will get there in whatever amount of time, and in that time period, you need to provide medical assistance before they arrive.
Why don't we take our mid-morning break? Members of the jury will take our 20-minute mid-morning break. The attorneys and I will deal with the issue while you're off break. And Lieutenant, you may step down if you wish. Just a reminder, you're still under oath.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Your Honor. Lieutenant Zimmerman, I want to draw your attention back to the incident on May 25th of 2020.
Yes.
Earlier, you told the jurors about being at the scene, finishing your work there. The next day, did you have an opportunity to review some video of that incident?
Yes.
And do you recall what that video, where you saw it?
Yes.
And was it we've been calling the Darnella Frazier video?
Yes.
Did you watch that video in its entirety?
Yes, I did.
And since then, have you had an opportunity to watch other video of the incident?
Yes.
And specifically, have you watched body-worn camera video of the incident from the involved officers?
Yes.
And based on that and your years of training and experience with the Minneapolis Police Department, you saw then Officer Chauvin with his knee on Mr. Floyd's neck, correct?
Yes.
Would you call what you saw there a use of force?
Yes.
And did that use of force continue until the ambulance arrived?
Yes, it did.
Was there any change in the level of force being used until the ambulance arrived?
No.
And what do you think about that use of force during that time period?
I'm sorry?
What do you think about that use of force during that time period?
A little vague. Could you limit it to the time frame?
Right. Okay. So, based on your review of the body-worn camera videos of the incident,
Yes.
and directing your attention to that moment when Mr. Floyd is placed on the ground,
Yes.
what is your view of that use of force during that time period?
Totally unnecessary.
What do you mean?
Well, first of all, pulling him down to the ground, face down, and putting your knee on the neck for that amount of time is just uncalled for. I saw no reason why the officers felt they were in danger, if that's what they felt. And that's what they would have to feel to be able to use that kind of force.
So, in your opinion, should that restraint have stopped once he was handcuffed and prone on the ground?
Absolutely.
And I should add to that question then also that it appeared he had stopped resisting.
I'm sorry?
And it appeared that he had stopped putting up any resistance.
Absolutely, I would stop.
I have nothing further, Your Honor.
Mr. Nelson.
I may just have a moment, Your Honor. Good morning, Lieutenant Zimmerman.
Good morning.
Thank you for being here today.
You're welcome.
So you testified that you have been a Minneapolis police officer since June 5th, 1985, correct?
1985, yes.
And prior to that, you were with another agency?
Yes.
And when you initially came on to the Minneapolis Police Department, you were a patrol officer, correct?
Yes.
And you were a patrol officer from 1985 to approximately 1993 when you took the sergeant's exam and were promoted.
Yes.
And so it's fair to say that since 1993, so 27, 28 years, you've not been on patrol in the city of Minneapolis.
Correct.
Your assignments have been investigative in nature, correct?
Yes.
And generally speaking, an investigative role is more of a follow-up type role, right?
Yes.
So an incident occurs on the street, it gets assigned to a detective, and then your job is to investigate the circumstances of that incident, right?
Yes.
And so it's fair to say that since 1993, you've not, other than perhaps for ceremonial reasons, you've not worn a uniform on a daily basis.
Well, I don't know if I would call it ceremonial.
Well,
I had to wear a uniform.
You have to wear a uniform from time to time, but your daily role is as a clothed police officer, correct?
Yes.
And you're not out patrolling the streets, making arrests, things of that nature.
No.
All right. And it's fair to say then that your experience with the use of force of late has been primarily through training.
Through what?
Your training.
Yes.
All right. Meaning you're not out actively, other than perhaps arresting a homicide suspect, you're not out actively patrolling and arresting people for less serious offenses.
No.
Right. And so you describe the use of force continuum as including mere presence being a type of the use of force, right?
Yes.
And so when you arrive on scene as a lieutenant in the homicide unit, that is a use of force, right?
If people know I'm a lieutenant, yes.
Or if they know you're a police officer, perhaps. Right. And then you described like soft techniques like escort holds, things of that nature, right?
Yes.
And I'm assuming that in the last, since 1993, and you were promoted to sergeant, you've handcuffed some people in that time frame.
I have.
Right. When's the last time you got in a physical fight with a person?
About in 2018.
Okay, so it's been a couple of years since you've been in a physical fight with a person?
Yes.
All right. And so you would agree that the use of force as an investigator is, or the higher levels of force as an investigator, is less likely than a patrol officer?
I'm sorry, I don't understand your question.
I'll rephrase it. The frequency with which you have to use higher levels of force as an investigator doesn't happen all that often, right?
Correct.
And so your experience generally as a use of force or involving the use of force is primarily in this annual what's called defensive tactics training, right?
Yes.
And the defensive tactics training is one of the requirements you need to use or to complete in order to maintain your license as a police officer, right?
Yes.
And you would agree that, or I'm presuming that since 1985 until the present day, tactics have changed as a police officer.
Some tactics have changed, yes.
Right. And it's fair to say that you are not a trainer in the Minneapolis Police Academy relevant to the use of force, correct?
That's correct, yes.
You do not teach other police officers defensive tactics.
No, I don't.
You would agree, however, that roughly 10 years ago, the Minneapolis Police Department kind of moved away from trying to hit people to control them and started using body weight to try to control people.
I don't think I would agree with that.
Okay, so you think that, I mean, within the arsenal, so to speak, of a police officer, it's as common to punch or strike someone in the use of force as it is to just use what are called takedown moves or body weight pins?
Yes.
Okay, and that's been throughout your entirety of your career?
Yes.
Okay, and so, and you're basing that again on your experience as just going through the defensive tactics requirements.
Right.
All right. And again, as a lieutenant and the #1 senior officer in the Minneapolis Police Department, I'm presuming that your understanding of the use of force involves the Minneapolis Police Department policies on the use of force, right?
Yes.
And the Minneapolis Police Department policies are designed, at least based on your understanding, to address the legal requirements for the use of force.
Yes.
And so there are factors, correct, to determine whether or not a use of force is proportional, reasonable, things of that nature, right?
Correct.
And what we look at in any particular case is the totality of the circumstances. Agreed?
Yes.
So there's lots of different information that a police officer has to use in order to determine the level of force to be used under which circumstances.
Yes.
Agreed?
Yes.
Now, in terms of the Minneapolis Police Department, are you familiar with the Minneapolis Police Department's critical thinking or critical decision-making model?
Yes.
And you would agree, I'm assuming again based on a long career, that an officer is constantly taking in new information, and that information will affect the decisions he or she makes, right?
That's correct.
And would you also agree that the training that you received initially as a police officer is probably a lot different than the academy now?
Yes.
Obviously, the available tools that officers have are a lot different today than they were in 85, 90, 95.
Yes. Body
Cameras, they didn't exist when you first became a police officer.
That's correct.
Tasers were not a thing either, right?
No.
You carried a gun and some handcuffs and kind of old school cop, right?
Yes.
Now, in terms of the decision making of a police officer, would you agree that there are certain pieces of information that officer has that affect his or her decisions on the use of force?
Yes.
And some of that information is very immediate, kind of low-level information. Agreed?
Yes.
So, for example, what just happened with this particular suspect, right?
Yes.
Is this suspect under the influence of a controlled substance, or is he sober?
Yes.
Right? What are you looking at in that moment through your own eyes, right?
Yes.
That's the officer's experience in any situation, right?
Right.
You look at other things that may be hazards or threats in the immediate vicinity, correct?
Yes.
So you're going to assess, are there people watching? Are there people videotaping? Are those people happy or angry, etc., right?
Yes.
You're going to look at what we would refer to as scene security, right?
Yes.
You have a responsibility as a police officer for your partners who may be close to you, right?
Yes.
You have a responsibility as a police officer for all of the people in the immediate area, right?
Yes.
And so scene security is kind of trying to keep it as tight as possible and keep everybody in the area safe. Agreed?
That's correct. Everybody.
In turn, you were asked a series of questions about your an officer's medical responsibilities.
I'm sorry?
You were asked a series of questions about your medical training and an officer's medical, what they're supposed to do.
Right, yeah.
Yeah. And even in the assessment of a medical emergency, there are many factors that come into that assessment, correct?
Yes.
To your knowledge, Minneapolis police officers they're trained medically at a fairly low level. They're not paramedics, doctors, etc.
That's correct.
You're a first responder.
Yes.
Basically, you're taught how to apply tourniquets, patches for gunshots, stop bleeding, basic CPR, and resuscitative efforts, right?
That's correct.
A police officer's job primarily is to keep the scene safe. Agreed?
I'm sorry?
A police officer's responsibility is to keep the scene secure and safe. Agreed?
Yes.
Minneapolis police policy requires the involvement of a higher level of medical intervention if the circumstances dictate, correct?
Yes.
And an officer is required, if someone is having a medical emergency, to take what steps are they're able to reasonably in the moment, right?
Yes.
And that would include potentially calling EMS.
That's correct.
But then, so you've got all of these immediate factors, right, that come into play. But then you can kind of widen that lens a little bit, and there are some other factors that come into play in terms of the use of force, again, based on your training and experience.
Yes.
Such as, what do we know about the location generally, right?
Yes.
Is this a field in the middle of the woods, or is this a higher crime area, right?
Yes.
An officer is evaluating that as a process, as a part of the process involving the use of force. Agreed?
Yes.
You look at other things such as tactical advantages or disadvantages. Agreed?
Yes.
So if you are not able to get what's called concealment or cover, that becomes a question, right?
In what?
Well, in a use of force, you're examining the surrounding area, right? To see if something happens, can I conceal and cover, right?
Yes.
You also, in addition to the scene security, you need to deal with securing the scene, which is different than scene security. Agreed?
Yes.
Scene security is maintaining the safety of everyone around, including yourself and your partners, right?
Yes.
Securing the scene is making sure that the scene itself is preserved and kept tight, right?
Correct. Yes.
And in fact, a police officer's responsibility and part of the use of force determination is to prevent or avoid the use of force against other people. Agreed?
Yes, absolutely.
So if you have to use force against one person to avoid using force against others, that's a factor that an officer should consider. Agreed?
I don't know if I would agree with that.
Okay. Again, within the training department, those people who are, it's their jobs to do that. They may be better to answer those questions?
Yes.
All right. And then even from there, you can widen the lens even further, and an officer will look at his training, right?
Yes.
What he is trained to do or not to do, right?
Yes.
He will look and take into experience, or he or she will take into account his or her own experience from their past career. Agreed?
Yes.
So things like fighting with someone, and what's the probability or possibility that that person is going to continue fighting with you in the future, right? Even after you have them subdued.
I don't know. I don't think I can agree to that totally, but
Okay.
I understand what you're saying.
There are circumstances where after a person is rendered unconscious, and then you perform, you revive that person, that they are more combative than they were initially. Agreed?
Oh, yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And again, in terms of your own past experience, an officer's own past experiences, they're taking that into consideration as well.
Sure.
Now, you testified that you were never, you have never been trained as a Minneapolis police officer to use a knee on the neck of a suspect.
That's correct.
You would agree, however, that in a fight for your life, generally speaking, in a fight for your life, you as an officer are allowed to use whatever force is reasonable and necessary, correct?
Yes.
And that can even involve improvisation. Agreed?
Yes.
Minneapolis Police Department policy allows a police officer to use whatever means are available to him to protect himself and others, right?
Yes.
So if there's a paint can sitting on the table and someone is attacking, you can use that paint can as a weapon.
Yes.
And in fact, you have been trained in the prone handcuffing techniques, correct?
Yes.
And it's your testimony that Minneapolis Police Department has never, ever trained anyone to put their knee across the shoulder and to the base of the neck?
I didn't say that.
Okay? So you would agree then that pursuant to Minneapolis Police Department training, when a suspect is arrested and in the process of being handcuffed or being restrained, it would be consistent with the Minneapolis Police Department training you've received to place your knee across the shoulder to the base of the neck.
I don't know if I've, part of your question was handcuffing, and we've certainly been trained to put the knee on the shoulder, but I don't know about just restraining a person. I don't recall being trained in that, but.
Okay. Again, possible based on the circumstances.
Sure.
Right? And when an officer is restraining a person and has called for EMS, have you heard the term that we're holding this person for EMS?
Yes.
Okay. And essentially that means you want to keep them in that position until EMS arrives because they're more capable to deal with whatever this situation is. Agreed?
No, I don't think I would agree with that.
Okay. How would you describe the term hold for EMS?
Hold for EMS is that you are holding him for EMS or her.
And sometimes people are held for EMS in a restrained position. Agreed?
Yes, sometimes, yeah.
Now, you also testified that once a person is handcuffed, the threat, I think you said, is gone. It's at the lowest threat level, right?
Yes, that's correct.
Now, that obviously, a person who's handcuffed can still pose a threat, right?
I suppose they could, yeah.
So an officer who is even though he has someone handcuffed, that person could continue to kick the officer.
Yeah, I suppose, yeah.
That person could continue to thrash his body around. Agreed?
Sure.
And part of the reason police officers restrain people is for that person's own safety. Agreed?
Absolutely, yeah.
Now, it also presumes that the handcuffs were placed on correctly, right?
Yes.
Sometimes in a struggle or an attempt to handcuff someone, handcuffs aren't placed on properly and they can pop open or be too big for a suspect, right?
Yeah, I don't know if I've ever seen them too big, you know, for a suspect. Sometimes they're too tight.
Okay.
But
if sometimes in the process of handcuffing someone, one handcuff goes on, thereby giving the suspect a potential weapon if he were to break free, right?
Yes.
Or she, for that
yes.
matter. And officers have been attacked with their own handcuffs, in your experience, right?
Oh yeah, yes.
So you would agree that the use of force is a dynamic series of decision making based on a lot of different information.
Absolutely.
And it's based upon a lot of information that is not necessarily captured on a body camera. Agreed?
Yes, that's correct.
The body camera is only so effective to show what the body camera sees and not what the officer sees.
That's correct.
Now, in terms of what you did in this particular case, essentially, you would be are you what's called Car 21? Is that the homicide unit? And I may
no, it's not.
Car 9? I don't know.
No.
You're just homicide. There's some car associated with homicide, right?
Yeah, yeah.
What car is that?
We would be car. Well, it would be like car 112 or 108 or 110.
Okay.
That kind of thing.
All right. So you got called, or you were made aware of this incident back on May 25th of 2020. You understood it to be a critical incident, correct?
Yes.
And it is Minneapolis Police Department policy to turn over the investigation of any critical incident, or the majority of critical incidents, we should say, to the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, right?
Yes.
And that is to avoid any potential conflicts between the involved officers, right?
Yes, that's right.
And so your role, you heard this call came out, and you kind of self-assigned to show up here?
Yes.
And you did that because you wanted to make sure the scene was secure, right?
Yes.
To make sure that the officers who had responded to the scene were doing the things that they should be doing in connection with a critical incident,
That's correct.
such as roping off or tying off the tape, or taping off the scene, I should say, right?
Putting up crime scene tape?
Yes.
Yes.
Not permitting citizens to come wandering through the scene, right?
Yeah.
Canvassing the area, I think you said. And ultimately, your role in this particular case was limited to a couple of hours of time, making sure those things were done, and until BCA agents arrive and you handed off the scene, right?
Yes, that's correct.
All right. And it was not until later that you were asked to review the body-worn cameras of the officers and consider the use of force, right?
Yes.
And it would not be within your normal role or job duties to do such a use of force analysis, right?
That's correct.
I have no further questions.
Redirect.
Lieutenant Zimmerman, you had the opportunity to review the body-worn cameras from
Yes.
officers involved.
Yes.
Did that also capture the bystanders on the sidewalk during the incident?
Yes.
Was there something about that group of bystanders that, in your assessment, was sort of, an uncontrollable threat to the officers at the scene?
No.
Would there be a way, or, well, I mean, I ask it this way. Would there be other ways for officers to deal with bystanders?
Yes.
And could that include calling for backup?
Yes.
Would the presence of multiple officers at a scene be a relevant fact for an officer to consider when using an amount of force on a handcuffed and restrained subject?
No. It shouldn't be.
Well, but if there's some concern about the crowd, would it be relevant that there were other officers already at the scene?
Oh, I see. Yeah. No, it doesn't matter, the crowd, as long as they're not attacking you. The crowd really doesn't, shouldn't have an effect on your actions.
You were asked if the use of force training has changed over time.
Yes.
Okay. But you still get the most up-to-date training every year when you go to the use of force training.
I do, yes.
And you were asked about, has the academy changed since you went to the academy?
Yes.
And you haven't been through the academy since then, correct?
Right, yeah.
But you have some familiarity with how the academy trains new officers.
Absolutely.
And do you think that academy training provides appropriate training for officers?
Yes, it should.
And would provide the most up-to-date training on the use of force for Minneapolis officers that take the academy type training?
Yes.
you were asked if you were a trainer, and you are not a use of force trainer.
That's correct.
You are a student of
Yes.
use of force. And, but it's your testimony that based on all the training you go through every year, it's well known that the prone position is dangerous.
Absolutely, yes.
Doesn't take a trainer to be able to say that. You've learned it.
Yes,
And that's been something that's been trained repeatedly.
absolutely. That hasn't changed.
You were asked about the critical decision-making model.
Yes,
Familiar with that from your training?
yes,
And part of that is continually reassessing the need for force.
correct.
It's a fair statement?
Yes,
And so that would include reassessing the location,
yes,
the tactical advantage,
yes,
conceal and cover,
yes,
scene security,
yes,
security and scene,
yes,
or security of the scene,
yes,
medical distress of the person restrained,
yes,
When you watched the body camera videos, did those videos capture those types of circumstances relative to the restraint of Mr. Floyd?
yes,
And you were able to assess those things in telling the jury what you thought earlier about the restraint of Mr. Floyd?
I am.
When you watched those videos, at some point during the restraint, did you see Mr. Floyd kicking the officers?
No, I didn't.
It may have happened initially, but after that, did you see any kicking?
No, none.
Defense counsel asked you about the concept of holding for EMS.
Yes,
So sometimes it's necessary to keep the person there so they can receive medical treatment.
that's correct.
Does holding for EMS excuse an officer from providing medical attention that they've been trained to provide?
No, it doesn't.
Does holding for EMS excuse officers from continuing to use this decision-making model about the use of force?
No, it doesn't.
Does holding for EMS excuse officers from using other resources like other officers at the scene to
No.
deal with? You were asked about handcuffs. If handcuffs are not properly locked, can they tighten?
Yes.
Can they loosen?
I'm sorry?
If they're properly connected, can they loosen?
Mm-hmm.
They can come open. But if they're locked, can they still tighten?
That's right.
If they're not, I think the term is double locked.
Right, yes.
And based on your review of the body cams, did you see any need for Officer Chauvin to improvise by putting his knee on Mr. Floyd for 9 minutes and 29 seconds?
No, I did not.
I have nothing further, Your Honor.
Any requests? All right. Thank you, Lieutenant. You may step down. Counsel sidebar? Right. Members of the jury, that's going to do it for today. So we're going to release you, adjourn for the day, and return hopefully to start 9:15 on Monday. We have a motion before that we have to deal with, so it might be 9:30. But let's shoot for 9:15. All right? Thank you. Have a good weekend.